There exists a fundamental principle that has governed power for millennia. No empire can maintain absolute control when its prosperity depends on those it seeks to dominate. For 30 years, the United States defied this ancient law, turning Silicon Valley into its most powerful geopolitical weapon. But this week, India just activated the termination code. On December 23, 2024, New Delhi blocked Google, Meta, and Amazon from critical sectors of its digital infrastructure. $250 billion in U.S. corporate control was dismantled with the signing of a single ministerial order. And here's what the corporate media doesn't want you to know. This is not an isolated technology policy. It's the retaliation of a nation that suffered decades of digital extortion, and it marks the collapse of the technological monopoly that sustained American hegemony in the 21st century. I worked at the IMF for years, where I saw this pattern repeat itself. Western powers use technological dependency as invisible chains. Now those chains are breaking, and the system we built is imploding from within. Let me show you exactly how we got here, because India's history under U.S. pressure is a catalog of systematic humiliation. In 1998, Washington imposed devastating sanctions against India after its nuclear tests at Pokhran. 14 years of technological isolation. American companies were prohibited from selling supercomputers, satellite navigation systems, advanced encryption technology. India lost $52 billion in potential economic growth during that period, according to the World Bank. But the sanctions didn't end there. In 2005, when India signed the defense agreement with Russia to acquire the S-400 missile system, the U.S. Congress immediately activated threats under CAATSA, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. 22 Indian companies were blacklisted from trade. $3 billion in defense contracts were frozen. Then came 2019. India bought Venezuelan oil at discounted rates during Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. Washington's response was instant and brutal. The Treasury Department threatened secondary sanctions against Reliance Industries and other Indian refineries. $4.7 billion in energy supplies were cut under U.S. pressure. India had to pay inflated prices for Middle Eastern crude controlled by U.S. allies. And when New Delhi continued buying Russian oil after February 2022, ignoring Western demands to isolate Moscow, Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, personally flew to India to issue economic ultimatums. 78 Indian companies were threatened with exclusion from the SWIFT banking system. But here's the part Washington really doesn't want you to examine. During all this time of political pressure and economic blackmail, Silicon Valley operated as the invisible arm of empire. Google controlled 87% of the search market in India. Facebook and WhatsApp had 580 million Indian users, more than the entire US population. Amazon dominated e-commerce with a 31% market share. And every byte of data, every transaction, every communication flowed through American servers. In 2020, the U.S. government tried to force India to ban TikTok and Chinese apps, not out of security concerns, but to transfer that entire market space to U.S. corporations. 1,400,000,000 people converted into digital hostages of Washington. $43 billion extracted annually from the Indian economy into Silicon Valley's coffers. I've seen this pattern before in dozens of countries. The IMF and World Bank impose liberalization reforms. U.S. tech corporations flood the market. They capture critical infrastructure. And then Washington uses that dependency as political leverage every time the target country deviates from the U.S.-approved line. It's digital colonialism with a terms of service contract. India endured this for 30 years because it had no alternative. American technological superiority seemed permanent. So what happened? On November 28, 2024, India's Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology issued a directive classified as confidential that was leaked to Reuters 3 weeks later. The order explicitly prohibited Google Cloud, Amazon Web Services, and Microsoft Azure from hosting government data or handling public digital service infrastructure. 122 government contracts worth $18 billion were immediately canceled. Gina Raimondo, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, faced her worst geopolitical nightmare. The numbers are devastating for Washington. India represents 17.7% of the world's population. Its digital economy is valued at $450 billion and growing at 23% annually. Silicon Valley projected extracting $78 billion from India in 2025 alone. Those revenues just evaporated. But here's the brutal irony, keeping Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, awake at night. The United States desperately needs India as a counterweight against China in the Indo-Pacific strategy. Washington spent $11 billion over the past 5 years courting New Delhi. The U.S.-India Strategic and Commercial Dialogue, the Critical and Emerging Technology Initiative, the Quad with Japan and Australia, all designed to tie India into an anti-China alliance. And now India just demonstrated it's not a pawn on Washington's chessboard. It's an independent player with its own interests and the capacity to defend them. Antony Blinken flew to Delhi on January 12, 2025 for emergency meetings. He arrived demanding reversal of the technology policy. He left empty-handed. India's Foreign Minister, Subramanyam Jaishankar, told him something in that meeting that perfectly summarizes the new geopolitical reality. You cannot declare war on your own banker and expect them to finance your hegemony. Let me explain exactly what that means. India owns $642 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. It's the 12th largest holder of American debt. Every time Congress passes another $2 trillion deficit spending package, someone has to buy those bonds. China already stopped buying. Japan is reducing its holdings. Europe is in recession. India was one of the last major buyers, keeping the American fiscal Ponzi scheme afloat. Now New Delhi has economic leverage to match its new technological muscle. Washington tried 3 different strategies to reverse India's technology blockade, and all 3 failed spectacularly. First, trade threats. Trade Representative Catherine Tai suggested reviewing India's status under the Generalized System of Preferences. India immediately responded by threatening 200% tariffs on U.S. agricultural products. $8 billion in U.S. exports at risk. Washington backed down within 48 hours. Second, technological pressure. The United States tried to convince the Netherlands to block sales of ASML lithography machines to India, mimicking the strategy used against China. India responded by accelerating its partnership with Japan on semiconductors. Canon and Nikon announced technology transfer agreements worth $23 billion. Washington lost all leverage over India's chip supply chain. Third, isolating India from security alliances. Pentagon officials suggested suspending joint military exercises and defense technology transfers. India responded by deepening military cooperation with Russia and France. Moscow offered S-500 systems at discount prices. Paris proposed co-production of nuclear submarines. The United States realized too late that pushing India toward Moscow and Beijing is exactly the opposite outcome the Indo-Pacific strategy intended to achieve. And here's the most humiliating twist of all. Gina Raimondo now has to fly to Mumbai to beg Indian tech companies to invest in the United States. Wipro, Infosys, Tata Consultancy Services. These companies employ 320,000 tech workers on U.S. soil. They generate $41 billion in annual revenue in America. Raimondo desperately needs those investments to continue to prop up the U.S. tech economy. But she can no longer demand anything. She has to negotiate from a position of weakness. The aggressor must now court the victim. It's a complete reversal of 30 years of geopolitical hierarchy. Now, I want to mention John Mearsheimer here, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, because his work explains precisely why Washington failed so catastrophically in India. Mearsheimer argues in the tragedy of great power politics, that states in an anarchic international system must maximize their relative power to ensure survival. The United States made the classic mistake of treating India as a subordinate state, rather than recognizing it as an emerging great power with its own security imperatives. Every time Washington weaponized technological dependency, it validated exactly Mearsheimer's analysis. Dependence on foreign powers is an existential threat that must be eliminated at any cost. Stephen Walt from MIT adds another critical layer with his balance of threat theory. India isn't simply balancing against China's power. It's balancing against the perceived threat of U.S. control over its digital sovereignty. Washington inadvertently threatened India more than Beijing did by turning technology into an instrument of political coercion. Graham Allison from Harvard documents this pattern in Destined for War. Established powers consistently underestimate the speed at which rising powers develop independent capabilities. The United States assumed India would remain technologically dependent for decades. Instead, New Delhi built alternatives in less than 5 years. Bangalore now produces more software engineers annually than Silicon Valley. Indian semiconductor companies are capturing contracts that used to automatically go to U.S. firms. Dependency evaporated faster than Washington strategists imagined possible. But what really keeps these theorists awake at night is the systemic implication. India isn't replacing U.S. dependency with self-sufficiency. It's building a multipolar technological architecture with China, Russia, Brazil, and South Africa. BRICS is creating a completely separate digital ecosystem from Western control. And once that infrastructure is fully operational, U.S. technological leverage over half the world will simply cease to exist. Now let me show you exactly how the global technological order is collapsing in real time, because what India just did is only the most visible manifestation of much deeper systemic fractures. The U.S. technological monopoly rested on two fundamental pillars. First, control over advanced semiconductors. Second, dominance of digital platforms and cloud services. Both pillars are now cracking simultaneously. Let's start with semiconductors because this is where Washington's panic is most acute. For 40 years, the United States had a magic trick. It designed the most advanced chips in California, manufactured them in Taiwan using Dutch machines, and then used export controls to deny that technology to adversaries. China needed 5-nanometer chips for artificial intelligence and quantum computing. Washington said no. Beijing had no alternative. Except now it does. On October 18, 2024, SMIC, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation of China, announced mass production of 5-nanometer chips using completely domestic lithography equipment. Zero dependence on ASML from the Netherlands. Zero dependence on U.S. applied materials. The Commerce Department independently verified SMIC's capabilities in November. The chips work. China just broke the technological stranglehold that was supposed to keep it subordinate for another decade. $78 billion the United States spent on the CHIPS Act to rebuild domestic manufacturing. All that money betting China couldn't innovate around U.S. controls. Beijing just proved the bet was wrong. But here's where it becomes truly catastrophic for Washington. India, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa. All these countries were watching to see if China could escape U.S. technological control. Now that Beijing has demonstrated it can, every one of these nations knows that dependence on U.S. technology is optional, not mandatory. India is buying chip manufacturing equipment from China at a fraction of the cost of Western suppliers. 22 Indian semiconductor companies signed agreements with Chinese manufacturers in December. $34 billion in technology transfer, completely bypassing the United States. Washington lost leverage over India's digital future before Raimondo even set foot on the plane to Mumbai. Now the second pillar, digital platform dominance. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta. These companies aren't just successful businesses, they're geopolitical infrastructure that Washington uses to project power. every search you perform on Google, every file you store on AWS, every message you send on WhatsApp, all flow through servers that comply with U.S. surveillance laws under FISA and the Cloud Act. The United States can access that data without a warrant if it involves foreign intelligence. For 20 years, this gave Washington unprecedented visibility into other nations' governments, businesses, and individuals. But that system just crashed against digital sovereignty. India isn't alone in blocking U.S. platforms. Brazil passed a data localization law in August 2024, requiring all Brazilian citizen information to be stored on servers within Brazilian territory. 63 U.S. tech companies now face fines of up to 4% of global revenues for non-compliance. Indonesia implemented similar requirements in September, Vietnam in October, South Africa in November. And here's the pattern that terrifies Silicon Valley. These countries aren't simply demanding data localization. They're building alternatives to U.S. platforms using Chinese and Russian technology. India replaced Google Pay with its unified payments interface system that now processes 9 billion monthly transactions. Brazil is adopting the Pix digital payment system that moves $450 billion annually. Russia offers its vKontakte platform as an alternative to Facebook. China exports WeChat and Alipay throughout Africa and Asia. What the corporate media doesn't want you to know is that these alternatives aren't inferior. In many cases, they're technically superior to U.S. platforms. Faster, cheaper, without NSA surveillance backdoors built in. Washington is losing 50 years of technological dominance in less than 5 years and has no strategy to stop it. Jake Sullivan announced the Democratic Technology Initiative on December 17th. It sounds impressive until you read the details. $3 billion spread over 5 years. China is spending $280 billion in 2025 alone on its digital Silk Road strategy. The United States is bringing a knife to an artillery gunfight. And the deepest irony, the sanctions Washington imposed for decades forced these countries to develop alternatives. India built its domestic tech stack because the United States repeatedly cut it off from Western technology. China invested trillions in domestic semiconductors because Washington weaponized export controls. Brazil developed independent payment systems after PayPal froze accounts under Treasury Department pressure. Every sanction, every threat, every ultimatum accelerated exactly the outcome the United States was trying to prevent: technological independence from adversaries and competitors. Now BRICS is institutionalizing this independence. On November 14th, the BRICS Summit in South Africa announced the Digital Infrastructure Initiative. $500 billion in coordinated investment over 5 years. Fiber optic cables bypassing U.S.-controlled routes. Data centers in BRICS nations. Cloud computing platforms that don't respond to U.S. subpoenas. Payment systems that bypass SWIFT and the dollar. It's not just technology, it's monetary sovereignty. It's geopolitical autonomy. It's the end of the U.S. unipolar order in the domain that mattered most, the digital realm. Are you enjoying the analysis so far? If you are, please subscribe to the channel right now. Join thousands of people who are waking up to the true dynamics of global power that mainstream media will never show you. And leave me a like on this video because the algorithm suppresses content that challenges established narratives. Your engagement literally helps break that censorship. And comment below where you're watching this from. I want to see how many of you are in the global south witnessing these changes directly versus those in the West still receiving propaganda about U.S. technological supremacy. This community we're building here is part of the larger awakening. Now let's get back to the systemic collapse. Here's why what India just did has immediate personal consequences for your daily life. U.S. technological hegemony sustained dollar privilege. Every digital transaction that crossed U.S. platforms reinforced dollar demand. Companies needed dollars to pay Google for advertising, to pay Amazon for cloud hosting, to pay Microsoft for software licenses. That demand kept the dollar artificially high, even as the Federal Reserve printed trillions. Now that India, Brazil, China, Russia, and others are exiting the US digital ecosystem, that structural dollar demand is collapsing. The dollar index fell 8.3% since India announced its technology blockade on December 23rd. If you hold your savings in dollars, you just lost purchasing power. If you live in the United States, your imports just got more expensive. Oil prices are climbing again because Gulf producers know dollar demand is falling and are demanding euros, yuan, and rupees. Your gas bill is going up. Food costs are rising because agricultural producers face higher energy and fertilizer costs denominated in multiple currencies instead of dollars alone. Your grocery store is going to charge more. This isn't future speculation, it's happening now. I've seen currency crises before: Venezuela, Argentina, Turkey. Purchasing power collapse happens fast once confidence breaks. The United States isn't immune just because it's wealthy. The Roman Empire was wealthy when its currency collapsed in the 3rd century. The British Empire was wealthy when the pound lost reserve status after 1945. Wealth doesn't protect against systemic monetary realignment. But here's the genuine hope amid this collapse, and why many of us in the global South see this as liberation rather than catastrophe. A multipolar world means no single power can use economic dependency as political blackmail. India can trade with Russia without fear of US sanctions. Brazil can set environmental policy without IMF pressure. South Africa can industrialize without World Bank debt designed to keep it as a raw materials exporter. For 70 years, Washington had an effective veto over every nation's development choices through control of finance and technology. That veto is ending. Yes, there will be turbulence. Yes, there will be dislocation. But ultimately, more nations will have more control over their own destinies. That's worth the short-term volatility. And here's the cold geopolitical forecast you need to understand for the next 10 years. The United States isn't going to collapse. It's not going to disappear. It will remain a formidable technological and military power, but it will no longer be the sole superpower setting rules for everyone else. It will be one pole in a multipolar system. Silicon Valley will continue innovating but will no longer have automatic access to global markets. Wall Street will remain influential but will no longer be able to weaponize the dollar system without consequences. The Pentagon will continue projecting military power but can no longer assume technological dependency will keep allies in line. This is the deepest adjustment in the global order since 1945. And what India just did to Silicon Valley is the clearest possible signal that the transition is no longer theoretical. It's already happened. The world just hasn't fully realized it yet. Stay alert, stay informed. What you witnessed this week with India blocking US tech giants isn't an isolated event. It's the first domino in a cascade of geopolitical realignment that will redefine global power in your lifetime. 30 years of technological monopoly ended with a ministerial order, and $250 billion in corporate leverage evaporated. You are witnessing how the foundations of the world order are being reorganized. Not from conference rooms in Davos or G7 meetings, but from New Delhi, Brasilia, Beijing, Johannesburg. The Global South stopped asking for permission, and Washington just learned it cannot declare war on its own banker and expect to win. The unipolar era has ended. Welcome to the multipolar world. It's chaotic, it's uncertain, but for the first time in decades, it's genuinely open.